Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Mentorship Mike. Today we have Howard Price with us. Howard, how are you?
John, it's great to see you and great to see everybody out there today.
Good to be here with you. Before we begin, I want to take just a few minutes and talk about all of the great things that you, Howard, have done. You've been around this industry for some time, journalism, and gosh, you've gone this way in your direction and that way in your direction. So we're excited to talk to you about that. But before we do, let me just share a bio with everyone so they understand where you've been. Howard is a two-time Emmy winner with over 50 years in broadcast news, from assignment desks and anchor chairs to crisis management. He's been at WABC TV, WNBC TV, and ABC News. He now teaches crisis communications at MIT, and he hosts the podcast Crisis in the First Person. Howard, good to have you with us.
John, it's my great privilege and honor.
Well, we met in New York City just over the summer, just 2 or 3 months ago now. And your CV, your background really impressed me. And we've had a chance to talk a few more times. And I think you just have a lot to offer people entering the industry. But before we begin, take us through your occupational journey, right? What does that look like for you? And were there any important mentors for you along the way?
Well, sure, John. I think if you talk to anybody in the journalism or broadcast business, they would tell you that there's always people who pay it forward, who came before you, who made the mistakes that you have yet to make, and who extend a hand and a guiding light to you. Sharing freely of their knowledge and their experiences, and telling you in a very, I think, unvarnished way, things that you probably would otherwise have to learn the hard way. Now, that doesn't prevent you from making mistakes. You will make mistakes because everyone in every profession does. The question is the way you recover from those mistakes. You know the old saying, it's not how you get knocked down, it's how you get back up. That's true in broadcast journalism as it is in any other field of human endeavor. My journey in this business started actually when I was about 5 years old, just shy of 6. And we all know November 22nd, 1963. I was watching my parents watching television along with the rest of the country, with TV news coming into its own as a result of the Kennedy assassination. I had never seen my father cry, never ever seen him cry. And he was crying as he was watching the coverage of what was going on in Dallas. And I said, whatever it is they're doing on that TV set, that's what I want to do. Because
Wow.
I could see the impact that this unfolding national tragedy was having on everyday people that were just sitting in their living rooms and watching this, in a sense, almost as if the country was spinning out of control suddenly, that the age of innocence that we thought we had now been shattered. It was, as many observers would write in the months and years after that assassination, the end of Camelot. It was the end of that very wonderful time where the country seemed to go nowhere but up. And suddenly we realized our own frailties, our own mortality, and we started asking a lot of questions of ourselves as a society, which really kind of dovetails beautifully with what we're doing here today, because what I hope we're going to accomplish at the end of all this is a very introspective look at the principles, the ethics, the morality, and the objectiveness that we need to bring to do a truly fair and complete and credible job as journalists. But so I'm 5 years old, and my grandfather had a big reel-to-reel recording machine, tape recorder, and a microphone. And as my mother likes to have told me, I went around interviewing people just spontaneously. How are you reacting to this? And I guess you could say the die was cast at that time. All through elementary school, I wanted to work in the news business. I wanted initially to be on the radio. I loved radio. It's theater of the mind. It requires you to both paint the picture and tell the story. I think that the best writers in television are people who came from radio. And I say that quite chauvinistically, but I really do believe that. It's been my experience. And then from middle school, our school district had received a fairly large sum of money from the state to build a television facility. And at the time, it was, I believe, the largest academic television facility between about Westchester and just north of New York City and Albany, the state capital. So, we were in pig heaven, those of us who really loved dabbling in TV, and part of the facility was also a closed circuit radio station. And so I was living the best of both worlds. I was anchoring a newscast as a seventh grader, and I was on the radio, and I was just really very happy. In high school, I continued to work through an internship in my senior year at one of our local radio stations. The famous story there is, I was doing what interns normally do, some little housekeeping around the station, and sitting and watching and being like a sponge and absorbing everything that was going on around me. And one day there was a big multi-alarm fire at a hotel in downtown Poughkeepsie, New York, where I grew up, and I did not have a driver's license yet, so I couldn't go and cover it. And the only other person in the newsroom was the news director, and he was supposed to go on the air in just a few minutes. He throws a stack of copy at me, shows me very quickly how to work the console, says, "When the jock does this, you're on the air, and good luck, you'll do fine." And
Wow.
it was
Trial
10
by
minutes,
fire.
10 minutes before my very first broadcast. 10 minutes. So, I managed to navigate that reasonably well, I guess. And then in subsequent summers, I was hired on as kind of a vacation relief freelancer by the same radio station. When I went to school in Chicago at Northwestern, I worked at WNUR, which is, of course, Northwestern's renowned radio station. And I got a job at what was then the Group W station, WIND, which was just flipping from top 40 to news and talk. So I was part of that very exciting transition into news and talk. I got to cover the famous blizzard of 78, where I didn't leave the station for about 36 hours. And before I left school, I had also covered the capture of the FALN terrorists in Evanston, which happened not very far from my dormitory. So I grabbed my tape recorder and headed down to police headquarters, and my picture with our station logo on the tape recorder was plastered on the Chicago Sun-Times front page. And that was my brief brush with fame. And then from there, after graduation, I went to Group W's TV station in Baltimore, WJZ, as a news writer and a producer and as an assignment editor. And then on to New York as a news writer at WABC Eyewitness News. And from there, I became a suburban bureau chief and an assignment editor, a field producer. I went to the Middle East twice to do mini docs with one of our local anchors, was in Gaza, was in the West Bank, traveled from border to border within Israel, spoke with all the key players on both sides of the conflict. The peacemakers, I sat in Saeb Erekat's villa in Jericho. Saeb, of course, was the chief Palestinian negotiator at the time. And I've had a chance to be an eyewitness and sit in a front seat to history. And I wouldn't have traded any of this for the world. I eventually had an opportunity to move into management. After 9/11, I had developed some expertise in business continuity and crisis management. I became certified as a business continuity professional. I went on to help coordinate business continuity and resilience for the ABC-owned stations group, then was hired on as the director of crisis management and business continuity for ABC News, then for the Disney ABC technology group, and then the business continuity function of the Walt Disney Company. And then from there, I went back into editorial. After about 38 years altogether at ABC, I went on to back into editorial at WNBC as an assignment editor, from which I retired in 2023. And now I'm enjoying the fruits of my labors. I do a little bit of consulting. I do teach as a guest lecturer at MIT in the short course on business continuity and crisis management and business resiliency. And I'm ramping up my own consulting practice now in crisis communications. And that, in a nutshell, is my life.
Wow. Wow. Yes, you have done some incredible things, and I can't imagine you slowing down. Just knowing you for as long as I have, you're still going hard. Howard, talk about, since we are talking about faith and media today, talk about the intersection of your faith tradition and what you've done occupationally. Where have those met? How have those influenced you?
Well, it's probably helpful to know that my mother was a Sunday school teacher. I grew up in the Jewish tradition, and my parents and my brothers and I were very active in our local conservative congregation in Poughkeepsie. We grew up as as youth leaders in the congregation. When I became an adult and I moved to where I live now in Rockland County, I joined the board of my synagogue here and sat on that panel for about 12 years. So it's very easy for me to say that the ethics and morality of my faith govern everything that I do. And I think it's very important for people to understand that when we talk about the influence of faith in the practice of journalism, when we talk about the considerations that go into how we decide what is news and how we cover it and how we conduct interviews and all of that, it's something that I think happens quite unconsciously, because it's something that, if you are raised in a community of faith, it's something that just becomes a part of you. I don't really look at Jewish law or Jewish scripture in a very literal way when I'm doing my job, but I do remember the teaching. I understand the custom and I understand the philosophy behind my faith system. And I do bring it to bear in terms of making sure that I am fair, in terms of making sure that my reporting is just, in my advocacy for people who are voiceless and who need to have their life circumstance elevated and made visible. These are all tenets of Judaism and have been since the inception of the faith millennia and millennia ago. So I think it's fair to say that I'm governed in a very real way, albeit often subconsciously and unconsciously, by the faith traditions in which I grew up.
Yeah, well said. Well said. I think you're right. It's hard to extricate our religious DNA from who we are day to day because we're always in the process of becoming. And if our faith is such a large, influential piece of our life, it's going to impact every aspect of our life. So,
And
yeah,
John,
very
I just want to latch on to a turn of phrase that you used, because I think it is very important for people to understand that there's a religiosity and there's a spirituality. And what are really the forces that come into play in the conduct of one's personal and professional life? And I would prefer to think of it in the spiritual realm rather than the religious realm, in the sense of dogma,
yes.
in the sense of practice and ritual. A lot of that doesn't enter into anything I do professionally, but the spirituality, the philosophy behind all of the religiosity is the stuff that governs how I do what I do as I walk through life.
Incredible. Great explanation. And I couldn't agree more. I think you said that perfectly. Okay, Howard, I just want to ask your thoughts on observations about faith in media today. There's no specific direction I want to point you, but from what you see and what you observe from your vantage point, maybe give a little bit of context, but how are those two interacting today? What do you see out there?
Well, I guess it depends on the platform, the channel, in some cases, the political philosophy that these platforms come from. I think you will either see a great reference and incorporation of some sort of faith-based something in some places that you might see less of in others. But I would like to think that everyone who practices good journalism, everyone who seeks to protect the people's right to know and to give a voice to the voiceless, is at least subconsciously acting in some sort of a spiritual way. They understand that something's fundamentally wrong. And so what they're trying to do is right the wrong, whether it's a misunderstanding that they want to correct, whether it is a discrimination that they want to point up and correct, whether it's corruption, whether it's an ignorance of whole segments of our community or a misinformation about segments of our community. I would like to think that most people, even those who don't consider themselves religious, if you will, but consider themselves humanist, they just believe in bringing a humanity, sans references to a deity, a divinity, any of that, just the decent thing to do as a human being. I still call that spirituality. I think most people would. It's just that it's not divine spirituality. It's humanistic spirituality. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I think that no matter how you roll the dice, that's really what's coming into play. If you're doing your job right, it doesn't mean that a particular religious philosophy should guide you to the exclusion of others. You need to understand others. I was very fortunate in that I studied when I was in religious school under an environment that encouraged us and proactively instructed us in the ways of other faiths. And so when I left my childhood religious education, I felt that I had some basic understanding, and that made me more sympathetic and more compassionate. And it made me a better listener. And by the way, it made me a better interviewer because I now knew about things that before that I didn't know a lot about. So the other thing that I would hope that a sense of spirituality brings to you as you do your job as a journalist is that you want to have this unquenchable curiosity, that you always want to know about other people, other faiths, other philosophies, other life experiences that you can compare and contrast, but also to be able to report them objectively as people describe them to you. I think that that's becoming something of a lost art. I think it's dangerous that it's becoming something of a lost art because I'd like to think that as human beings, we're all very smart people and we can make up our own minds about what we see and hear so long as it's facts and facts alone. And we're left to analyze those facts, process those facts, and draw our own conclusions, and then develop actions in response to those conclusions.
Yeah, yeah, very well said. Very well said. And love your idea around pluralism too. It's I think that's one of the benchmark strengths of our country traditionally and hopefully moving forward is the fact that again, bigger ears than mouths, hopefully, right? In an ideal state where we can listen, be curious, etc., like you said.
So this is a good opportunity because I believe that every once in a while you need to inject a little levity into a very serious discussion. And I think, John, I told you this story when we first met. When I was in Chicago, I was a studio producer for WIND when we flipped to News Talk. And I was given the task on more than one occasion to be the studio producer, the call screener, if you will, for Father Mike Furland, who was our host for Religion on the Line. So you have a Jewish producer and a Catholic priest that are working in the same place. And no, please, no jokes about a Jewish producer and a Catholic priest walk into a bar. But
Right, right.
that's what this was. And one day I'm on the air, Father Mike and I are on the air, and Father Mike, there had been some development in the Middle East. And so Father Mike opened up the phone lines and said, we'd like to hear your thoughts about what you think we need to do to bring a lasting peace to the Middle East. And he gives the phone number of the radio station, and I'm waiting for the phones to ring. Phone line rings. I pick up the phone. Guy says, hi, it's Joe in Wheaton, and I have the perfect solution to peace in the Middle East. As I said, okay, Joe in Wheaton, I've got you on the screen. When you hear Father Mike's voice through your phone line, turn your radio down and just speak in a loud, clear voice, and we'll all hear you. And just stand by when you hear Father Mike. Father Mike punches him up, says, it's WIND, Religion on the Line, Father Mike here. And I understand we have Mike from Wheaton who has or Joe from Wheaton with the solution for peace in the Middle East. And what Joe from Wheaton decides to do is to call for the mass extermination of Jews. Now, fortunately, we had a dump button, and so that never made it on the air. And Father Mike looks up at me through the glass, and he's laughing. He's laughing until he's red in the face because somehow this mindset still exists in a city as cosmopolitan as Chicago. But we got along famously, and we had a terrific mutual respect for each other. I learned so much from Father Mike. He learned so much about Judaism from me, and I loved doing Religion on the Line. And he was the perfect host because he was open-minded and just genteel and inquisitive and embracing. For those who are in the New York area, if you watch the way Cardinal Dolan hosts his Sirius XM radio show and his TV programs, it's the same mindset. He sits there and he listens. He listens more than he talks. And it's what makes him the perfect talk host. And I think that in some ways, talk radio in all of its different flavors would be far better, perhaps, if we had more of our best spoken religious leaders from all faith extractions on the air. And, I told you about the joke, a Jewish producer and a Catholic priest walk into a bar. I would love to do a show with a rabbi, a priest, and an imam who walk
Yeah.
into a bar, who
Yeah.
literally sit down in a bar and host their radio show from a bar, and it's called A Rabbi, a Priest, and an Imam Walk into a Bar.
Love that. Love that. We need to tee that up. I love that concept. Yeah, very good. Very good. Okay, Howard, let's transition over to something I call our micro musings, right? Our mentorship micro musings. So quick call and response, just 15 to 30-second answer after a question that I give to you. Breaking news or long form?
Both for different reasons. Breaking news to get information that is important for people to know that may impact life and property right away. Long form for context, depth, and perspective.
Well said. Well said. Okay, we're going to draw on your deep well of experience here. 9/11, 2003 Northeast blackout, or Superstorm Sandy? Which one tested you the most as a journalist and why?
As a journalist, 9/11, I was stuck outside the city. I couldn't get in. It was an all hands on deck event. I felt very, very badly about that. So I went to the nearest place in the suburbs that I could get to where suburban first responders were gearing up to go into the city. And I reported live from there. And I assisted reporters who themselves were also caught outside the city in terms of getting their video in. I famously commandeered the last 30 seconds of satellite time that were available out of the greater New York area to get a piece in that we had shot, and we didn't get all of it in. We got as much as 30 seconds of satellite time would allow us to feed. But I think if you asked most journalists who have covered multiple horrific, historic events, 9/11 would always rank among the most impactful. By the time Superstorm Sandy and the blackout came around, the blackout, I was still working in news. I was working in local news. That was impactful, but basically I was sitting on my tush for about 8 hours in a live truck because our radio system had gone down. And so the only way we could communicate with the helicopter was for me to talk on a two-way radio in one of our spare live trucks and have a handheld radio in my other hand that was talking to the control room. So for 8 hours, that was what I did. I basically coordinated some of our live coverage. And Superstorm Sandy, I was already in corporate crisis management. I'd like to think that my efforts and the efforts of my team kept the ABC television network on the air. In New York, we had taken great pains to move critical operations out to Los Angeles. So when you sat at home, you had no idea that your signal was probably coming from Los Angeles, but ABC never left the air. So from an operational point of view, that was certainly a noteworthy event for me.
Absolutely. Wow. Incredible. So Howard, tell us, how would you describe your newsroom leadership style? Is there a single word you might describe that with?
I would hope that the word that would be ascribed to me would be compassionate and competent. That is not to say that I've never lost my temper in a newsroom. I have famously lost my temper in a newsroom. We do have a reputation among those who've worked with me the longest and who like me the best of not suffering fools gladly, because I believe that there's a certain amount of self-learning and initiative that we all need to take no matter what our professional endeavor. And if you sit there waiting for someone to tell you what to do without taking the initiative to try and figure out what it is you need to do and how to do it, then you're really not ready for the big time. Hand-holding is something that doesn't even happen very, very often anymore in the smallest of markets. And to have gotten to a place like Chicago or New York and expect it to happen there is a bit unrealistic. A lot of young people might argue that with me, and they feel that, someone tolerated you when you were a young person. And yes, they did. And they did the same thing to me that I'm doing to you. And that is, I'm throwing you in the deep end. I'm going to watch you to make sure you don't drown, but I want you to try and figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Well said. Give us a time in your career, Howard, when it could have been in the newsroom, it could have been out actively working as a journalist, but where you said, this is why I do this work.
Well, I would like to think that every meaningful story I've done is a reflection of the reasons I got into this business. I've been responsible for several legislative initiatives along with the reporters that I've worked with, probably more than one investigation that was launched because of reporting of which I was a part. I could point to the work that our newsroom did during COVID, a very fraught time in this country where reliable information was becoming increasingly hard to find. And I'd like to think that the work that I did and the work that my colleagues did helped that along in a very big way. Certainly the work during and after 9/11, without any question, as we began to question ourselves as a country, as we began to question ourselves as a society. The stories I loved the best actually happened September 12th and after. And I keep saying to anyone who will listen, I wish we could go back to being the country we were on September 12th,
Yeah.
because we were united and we were people deeply committed to a righteous way forward. We wanted to revere the memories of those we had lost. There was a segment of our population that perhaps was justifiably vengeful, but our better angels prevailed, I think, all in. I think our better angels prevailed, and I loved the way the country pulled together. We didn't care if we were black or white or brown or yellow. We didn't care if we were a Jew, a Gentile, a Muslim, or any other faith. We didn't care if we were Democrats, Republicans, liberals, or conservatives. What we cared about was that we were Americans and that we had been grievously wounded. And we needed to do what Americans always do, and that is pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and sally forth so that the republic could survive and continue to prosper. And I do believe in those early days after the war, we were a light unto the world, and we were also a fearsome light unto the world, because, as was famously said in the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack, the one thing you don't want to do is wake a sleeping giant.
Well said. Well said. All right. Well, Howard, from a retrospective perspective, you have seen a lot of change in your 40 plus years in journalism. Do your best looking forward prospectively into the crystal ball of the next 10 years. What do you expect will change the most based on what you've seen the last 40 years and what you see on the horizon?
Well, I think that, I'd be a fool if I didn't say that operationally the nature of broadcast news has changed. The whole news business has changed. Everyone is now their own editor-in-chief, their own program director, their own reporter, their own videographer, their own editor. And that's good and bad. It certainly democratizes news gathering, but it also lends itself to very opinion-driven, politics-driven, selective coverage of things, and because a lot of these so-called citizen journalists are coming at this from a particular personal or political or religious perspective, you don't always get the full picture of what's going on. So we have to figure out, I think, a way to balance those two. I love the democratization of the process. I want to make sure it stays fair and as centrist as it can possibly be, and to allow and allows basically a focus on the presentation of facts without extraneous commentary, except to point out inconsistencies in the facts, and then leave it up to the viewer or the listener or the reader to figure out who has the greater propensity of truth. I think back often to a line that Woodward and Bernstein famously used when they were discussing Watergate and their Watergate coverage. And they said our job was to find the best obtainable version of the truth. They didn't say our job is to find the truth. Their job, in their eyes, was, and still is today, to find the best obtainable version of the truth. And I think that people don't understand that really is how journalism works. It's not that someone is trying to shove a truth down your throat. If it's done right, it's to find the best available set of facts that will allow you to determine what is the truth.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Okay, as we enter the last few minutes, Howard, I would love for you just to take whatever time you need to talk to the 20-somethings that are going to be entering journalism in the next few years. Maybe they're entering now. What pieces of advice would you give to them based on what you've experienced over the decades that you've spent in the industry, and what should they expect? What should they look out for?
Well, I guess the first two words out of my mouth would be good luck. I was very fortunate in that, for example, when I graduated from college, I graduated with two guys who graduated a few months early to become part of the charter group of hires at CNN. Think about that. I witnessed the birth of CNN. The Fox network, over-the-air network hadn't gone on the air yet, much less Fox News. MSNBC didn't exist yet. The 500 or 700 some odd different channels, 1,000 or more channels of cable television did not exist back in 1980 when I graduated from college. Even when I went to grad school and had finished an MBA in 1993, the landscape of the business then had just started to change, and no one could really have envisioned where we're at right now. When I was working at WABC, I had a cell phone that was this big, and
One
I
of the
needed a
brick.
bag to carry it. And
Yeah.
then that's if I was using a portable version. And the one in my car was about this big, and it had to be mounted on a pedestal near my gear shifter. That's how big it was. The idea of this being allowed to do television as good or better than what you're watching at home was a fantasy, a fantasy. And now young people are being asked to do all of that and more. They're being asked to shoot for traditional journalistic outlets in the traditional way with the traditional equipment. They're also being asked to post online almost everything they do. It's a series now of rolling deadlines from the minute you walk in to the office to the minute you go home. And let's face it, with the way a lot of news outlets are staffed these days, it would not be surprising if you were sitting there, you young people, and looking at me and saying, "What mean you by this phrase, go home?" That's kind of where we're at now. I always thought I worked very hard in this business. My son is a reporter and an anchor now for a TV station in Springfield, Massachusetts. And I would dare say he's working harder than I ever did. And I worked pretty hard. And I worked a lot of long shifts and a lot of 6 days and a lot of holidays and a lot of nights and overnights. But I don't think I ever worked as hard as he works. So it's a different milieu now. It's never paid exceptionally well, but in the past, it probably paid a little better than it's paying now. And you have to learn to be flexible. You have to learn how to develop a brand of your own. And I think, by the way, John, that's an interesting dovetail again with how faith intersects. How do you
Yes.
stand out in this business? You stand out by being different. You stand out by being unique. You stand out in the way you seek and dispense information. And in some ways, maybe the subconscious ways you approach it will make you stand out and will define you as something different than a cookie cutter reporter who just goes in, regurgitates the facts, and goes home. We're more interested now in the why of something, what the impacts on our personal lives are, than just a pure recitation of the day's facts. That requires more work. That's harder work. But I think that taken as a whole, that's kind of where the business is going. I would tell you to be a jack of all trades and as much of a master of as many as you can. B, I would tell you to learn everything you can about the digital environment for news gathering. Become very, very competent editing on your smartphone or your tablet, shooting on a smartphone or a tablet, being able to dispense very complicated stories in very small snippets that attract an online audience, a social media audience, because, we humans have an attention span 1 second shorter than a goldfish. A goldfish is 8 seconds. A human being is 7 seconds. Think about that. An attention span of 7 seconds. That's why TikTok is TikTok. That's why
Yeah.
Instagram is Instagram,
Yeah.
because you are trying to grab people before they become disinterested or distracted. That's an art.
Yes. Yeah. Figuring out hooks and how to keep people interested. Yeah, that's an art in and of itself, like you say. That's great. Well, Howard, this time together has been so great. You obviously have learned so much and you're so wise over your decades of journalism. Thank you for sharing with their young friends entering the industry, and we sure appreciate you being on.
It's been my pleasure and privilege, John. Thank you so much for the honor of having me. And if I've dispensed any usable wisdom, it's a good day for me.
All right. It has been a good day. Thanks again, Howard.
Be well, everybody.